Scientists at Season led work on the World Bank's Groundswell Report series, which developed projections of climate migration within 106 countries out to the year 2050, resulting in 10 reports focusing on low-income regions and countries. In 2020, the Climate Mobility Network brought together faculty at 6 schools to develop coursework and foster research, including projects funded by NSF, the Department of Defense Minerva program, NASA, and a number of other funders. In 2023, that network transitioned to a global knowledge hub for the Global Center for Climate Mobility, GCCM. GCCM's initiatives have succeeded in foregrounding the need for careful planning around mobility as the planet changes. At the local level, Columbia's projects on coastal resilience building in the New York City region have focused on community participation and nature-based solutions while pursuing climate justice. You can learn more about these initiatives by picking up a copy of the fall 2024 issue of Columbia Magazine at the registration desk. A natural outgrowth of these activities was the organization of the MR Conference Series. And so we've really been pleased to see how the series of convenings has fostered a community of researchers and practitioners. Many early career researchers have found these conferences to be formative, and in the past years, we've been pleased to host side meetings for private sector firms as well as US government agencies. So, thank you for being part of the conversation. Thank you for having an impact. We're glad you're here, and I hope this conference sparks new ideas and insights and even further impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Abramson. I'm just checking to see if Kamal Amakrane, who is in Berlin now at a sister conference called the Climate Mobility Forum. He is on screen. Welcome, Kamal. We're looking forward to what you have to say.
Greetings to all from Berlin. Thank you very much, Alex, for the kind introduction. Dear friends, President Carlos Alvarado, Dean Abramson, Alex, ladies and gentlemen, dear experts and colleagues. On behalf of the Global Center for Climate Mobility, it is my pleasure to join you in opening the MR2025 conference entitled Mobility, Adaptation, and Wellbeing in a Changing Climate. We are very pleased to partner with the Columbia Climate School in hosting this important event. I very much regret not being able to be with you in person while the MR2025 is gathering the climate mobility ecosystem on your side of the Atlantic. We are also convening on this side in Europe and bringing together the ecosystem here in the first ever Berlin Climate Mobility Forum today and tomorrow. Our efforts aim similar to what you are pressing forward back home in New York to build momentum with European stakeholders following the UN Ocean Conference in Nice and ahead of negotiations towards COP in Brazil. Both these events are part of our ongoing effort to build a global climate mobility ecosystem around a common agenda. Ensure that we have clear tenets of engagement, solid principles to lean on, and we are very proud and pleased with our partnership with the Climate School led by Alex de Sherbinin, which has been a cornerstone of our work from the beginning. For those who have little knowledge of the story, together we had produced novel modeling work and climate mobility projections for Africa, the Greater Caribbean. We worked together for the global compact for mobility, for migration, the GCM, and we established the Global Knowledge Hub as an engine for data-driven analysis and solutions. We are currently together localizing our knowledge, climate mobility knowledge, through country and city deep dives. And here in Berlin, we're also launching our new Climate Mobility Academy with our first cohort of 12 young, dynamic, very smart fellows coming from Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, and the Pacific. We very much look forward to deepening our collaboration with all of you, with the Climate School, as well as all interested partners. Indeed, now more than ever, we must be focused and strategic. Climate action commitments are slipping out of reach. Forced displacement is the human face of the climate crisis. Climate change is already amplifying many drivers of human mobility, particularly conflict, political and social evil, but also economic instability. Climate hazards also lead to increased immobility and rising vulnerability as people become trapped in risk-prone areas. For some countries and communities, climate impacts like sea level rise present an existential threat. Their very territorial integrity, sovereignty, rights, and heritage are at stake. These are populations that, if unaddressed, if their unprecedented adaptation journey is not addressed, they will be forced out of the land that nourished their ancestors for centuries. So very much everything is at stake for them. The GCCM has been galvanizing a global coalition of countries to highlight the existential threats of sea level rise and enable affected nations to chart positive adaptation journeys for their people and communities. Of course, this will require international guarantees to preserve statehood continuity, maritime zones, culture. We also need, for those who little can be done to support local adaptation, we will need to ensure safe, responsible climate mobility pathways that are anchored in dignity and rights. There are initial steps in the right direction. And we are very happy that with our partners in the Rising Nation Initiative, working closely with the government of Tuvalu, we have seen the Philippine Union Treaty between Tuvalu and Australia, and also the Pacific Regional Framework for Climate Mobility. We are also happy for the call, whether in Eastern Caribbean region, for a regional climate mobility framework. And of course, being here in Berlin, but before in Nice, we see and we hear people interested and keen to lead from the front. Dear friends, yet much remains to be done. While new crises and disasters occur almost on a daily basis, current level of climate action and climate finance are far from what climate justice will demand. Countries and communities on the front lines of the climate crisis can prepare and adapt. They have done it and they can do it. But they need the data, the knowledge, the capacity, and the resources to do so. On this, I leave you with our three ambitions as we finish the 5th year of the Global Center for Climate Mobility. First, ensure that data and information on climate risks and climate mobility hotspots is available, accessible in risk-prone and vulnerable areas. We need to make sure that such information is, for the lack of a better word, digestible and friendly use format. Work with governments, Second, work with governments and affected communities on planning for climate mobility so people's right to stay is protected. And when they are forced to move or no other choice is left than moving, it is done with agency and dignity and anchored in their right. It is quite surprising, and it was honest outcome of our research to find that when it comes to the climate crisis, when it comes to the nexus between climate shocks and human mobility, the primary priority or the priority of populations is to adapt locally. Last but not least, it's localizing climate finance. And the purpose is not the finance. The purpose is the agency of the people, ensuring community-led adaptation projects, ensuring community-led design, ensuring community-led agency. I am very happy to share with you that what the Community Climate Adaptation Facility, CCAF, that we announced, we launched last September on the margins of the UN High-Level Week, has kickstarted with 7 pilot countries across 3 regions: Pacific, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And we are currently rolling out our first grants of the CCAF in Fiji. We look forward to kickstarting this work in the other champion countries in the next weeks. I cannot finish my remarks without extending my sincere and grateful gratitude to President Carlos Alvarado, chair of the GCCM Foundation's Advisory Board, for his leadership and partnership with the GCCM. He has been a steady force for the most vulnerable. He has been a solid pillar on which leaders from small island developing states have leaned on for advice and support. And we found in him a unique source of energy, hope, and momentum. We look forward to engaging with all of you during our joint transatlantic dialogue session tomorrow. My colleagues on the ground look forward to engaging with you. We aim to home in on priorities for the near future as we continue to build coalitions and drive actions in support of frontline communities. Empathy is strength, cooperation is strength, collaboration can take us far. By working together, we can move forward with clarity, with purpose and resolve, and you can find, and you can expect from us to be a solid partner to that end. Thank you very much again for your time, and I wish you all a very successful conference, and I would like to again acknowledge, recognize, and congratulate the organizers for smoothless preparation and a thorough preparation for this important conference. Thank you again.
Thank you, Kamal. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow during the Transatlantic Dialogue. Next up is Bruce Usher, who's the director of the Tamer Institute for Sustainable Investment and Climate Change. So, Bruce.
Good morning. So I'm the final introductory speaker before we get to the main event today. I'm going to be very, very brief in my comments. So I am on the faculty of both the Columbia Business School and the Columbia Climate School, and faculty director of the Tamer Institute for Social Enterprise and Climate Change. And I'm very pleased that for the first time, the Tamer Institute at Columbia Business School is co-hosting MR2025, and that several of your panels and events will be at the Columbia Business School on our campus. When you think about managed retreat and business schools, this is a rare combination. In fact, up until a few years ago, I would say that among the business schools in the US and globally, there was very little emphasis, very little time focused on climate change. And that has really changed, especially here at Columbia. So I just want to say a few words about that and why that is. 5 years ago, the Dean of Columbia Business School, Costa concluded that climate change was one of two macro trends that would impact business over many decades to come. One of those trends is data science and AI, and the other macro trend is climate change. And that those two trends would impact the business community for many decades to come, and it was incumbent upon us to prepare our students as they graduate and our alumni to address climate change and those issues. As a result, we created an introductory course on climate change, which is now taught to 500 business school students annually. That's followed by 4 deep dive courses in climate finance, climate policy, climate risk, climate technology, and half a dozen specialized electives that go along with that. We also, this year, jointly launched with Columbia Climate School a degree, a master's degree in climate finance. And that first cohort of that program will be joining us this fall. Every year, we host dozens of conferences, speakers, and seminars on climate change at the business school. However, to date, we have not focused on climate adaptation. That's now beginning to change, starting with co-hosting MR2025. As climate change accelerates, the business community will have to confront the reality of adaptation and managed retreat, and your research will be increasingly important to our business community. So welcome to Columbia University, welcome to Columbia Climate School and Columbia Business School, and thank you for joining us this week.
Great. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, His Excellency Carlos Alvarado, who was the 48th President of Costa Rica from 2018 to 2022, when his constitutionally limited term ended. Under his leadership, Costa Rica contributed to global efforts to combat climate change and defended human rights, democracy, and multilateralism. President Alvarado is a recipient of the 2022 Planetary Leadership Award by the National Geographic Society for his outstanding commitment and action towards protecting the ocean. And in 2019, he received, on behalf of his country, the Champion of on the Earth Award for policy leadership presented by the United Nations Environment Program. Also in 2019, he was named one of Time Magazine's 100 Next Emerging Leaders around the world who are shaping the future and defining the next generation of leadership. President Alvarado's prior government leadership service includes a tenure as Minister of Labor and Social Security and as Minister of Human Development and Social Inclusion, and Executive President of the Joint Social Welfare Institute, responsible for implementing social protection and promoting poverty alleviation programs. With that, I want to welcome you to the podium, and we're looking forward to your remarks, President Alvarado.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Thanks to the organizers, to Columbia University, to the GCCM, to the Climate School, to the Business School, to the Lincoln Institute. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. And the objective of these remarks will be to share a little bit of lessons or learnings that I've gathered throughout my own journey. Perhaps will be the first time informed that I'll be speaking about some things that are considered as success. I'll be talking about what I consider are probably my own mistakes in approach. And the idea of that is to share some value with you. And if anything that I say ends up having an insight for your own work or an idea, or actually something you don't agree with, but it's helpful because of that, I will call that success. So that's how this was created and this was designed. Recently, I've been thinking a lot after working on climate, on biodiversity, on many aspects of public policy, that the crisis that we experience as humanity, it's not only related to things that we can solve with technology or with public policy or with many people. I've been discussing that what we have, we can call it a crisis of thought, crisis of imagination, a crisis of being. Sometimes we believe that with technique, with science or technology or policy or politics, we can solve it. And I think this goes a little bit beyond that. Not a little bit, it goes beyond that. It's about policy, it's about technology, it's about human behavior, but it has to be, I have the intuition, it has to be done more comprehensively. So I like to start with this quote from David Bohm, which I found recently to give lots of inspiration about how to think different from the world of physics, and said, thought creates our world, and that says, I didn't do it. And I think I'm going to share some of that, and you'll see what I mean. So this is some images about the National Decarbonization Plan of Costa Rica. We launched that plan on February 2019, a little less than a year after we took office. And we had a strong commitment to do a decarbonization plan for Costa Rica. It was endorsed by the youth, it was endorsed by the environmental sector of the country, and many people endorse it. Actually, there on the picture you can see not only myself and the First Lady, but also Cristiana Figueres, who was also Costa Rican, but was the head of UNFCCC during the Paris Agreement. So we were really committed to this, and the plan was created with the insight that we need to disengage the curve of growth from the curve of emissions. That was the key insight. Also, that will be very political, if you ask me. Why? Because we could have say, well, instead of the curve of growth, you could have put there well-being, could have been more precise, but then try to sell that in a context of politics. Vis-a-vis the discussion we have now on degrowth, for example. If you run a campaign in the global south saying you're going to degrowth the country, chances are that might not be necessarily very, very productive. But anyway, that was the main insight, how to keep the whole of the society thriving in a transformation, not an environmental transformation, a transformation that throughout the plan goes in 10 axes: industry, commerce, residence, forestry, agriculture, transportation, public transportation, private transportation. How you change all the dimension of what we do without decreasing or diminishing well-being, on the contrary, increasing people's well-being, but disengaging from emissions. And that was the insight of the plan, and it's a plan that's still going. It's a plan for a 50-year framework. And let's say that's what some call a success, let's say. But I want to perhaps in a bit come back to now, with that thinking of the profound change we need, what would I do different now on this field? And I want to stress that word, decarbonization. It was a national plan of decarbonization. So, well, that's one example. Let's go to another one. Well, I was in office during the pandemic. I started on 2019. We did lots of difficult things in Costa Rica. We needed to pass a fiscal reform. We worked to make same-sex marriage legal. We watched a big political discussion in Costa Rica, and many difficult things. And at the end of 2019, I signed a bill to make therapeutical abortion for women accessible in cases of risk of their life during pregnancy, also very contested in a conservative country. And I remember in December of 2019 saying, okay, this is the last difficult thing I'm going to do as president. So you know what happened. So here along came the pandemic, and in the pandemic, our approach was really based, similar to the decarbonization plan. Best science in the room, best experts, multifunctional teams debating the measures, following those guidelines to try to protect our population, to try to do just about that. And we did to some extent. I mean, I'm calling this success, but with a disclaimer. Costa Rica was in the best quintile of the planet in performance on COVID. That means the least excess death during COVID because of this measured by this gentleman, Dr. David Bishai, who was at Johns Hopkins, currently on Public Health University in Hong Kong. We were one among the first on the planet to receive vaccines because of how we organize ourselves and how we, on the one side, push for COVAX, for vaccines for everybody, and on the other side, also work with the different firms in the trials to have access. So let's say we had in terms of life and of that, we had a good performance. But still, what happened in the pandemic remains a very contested issue back home, very polarizing. And I want to bring another thing to the attention. Stay at home. Because stay at home became one of the taglines of the strategy to protect people. But looking back, perhaps stay at home was not the best way of framing it. Because there were some people that could not afford staying home. And in a developing country that could not afford to sustain people staying home. So that itself, even it was meant to be a protection message, became a very threatening one, looking back. So I'll come back to this. What is it that I'm talking about? And I'll go back to my friend David Bohm for inspiration. I know that's lots of text, but I'll try to go to that shorter version of it, but I'll leave the slide so you can, by yourself, say it's accurate. You don't have to trust me on that. But in these propositions, he says, basically, we divide things to reduce them to manageable proportions. That's very human. Actually, that's how we do reasoning, how we do science, lots of time. We reduce reality from the factors, the complexity, to some that we can actually handle in a comprehensive way. But then he says, man, and I will add women, ceases to regard those divisions as tools and begins to see and experience himself in his world. That's what is he saying? We're taking that reduction of reality not as a tool to make it more manageable, but then we start to use it as if that reduction is reality itself. So we start to shift from theory as a tool for insight to reality as the way things are. And that's kind of sounds like an easy thing, but what I look and how profound it is, it's how this shapes our approach on things, on public policy, on science, on narrative, on how we engage with communities. You see where I might be heading. This reminded me a lot of something I read when I was, well, as many of you young students back at university, when I read, yes, I did that. I got into philosophy while studying. I was doing journalism, I got into philosophy, and I got into a class, free student class, of reading the Tractatus Logicus Philosophicus of Wittgenstein. So I got into that. You can tell I was pursuing an education and I was not hitting on somebody on the class. It was just, yeah, very random thing. But I remember from that book, when Wittgenstein proposed all that thinking, at the end he says, you have to throw away the ladder, somehow, in the last proposition. And that's a picture related to that, saying that some of the knowledge you gain from intuition, you throw away the ladder already when you climb up. That was kind of the analogy he came with that. Well, I think that's what we're doing a lot. We climb to a certain level of knowledge and we throw away the ladder. And what I'm questioning and we don't do that necessarily deliberate, but the knowledge we start to build, or the tools to build on knowledge, we start to equate literally as reality, and we act upon it. Talking about what was mentioned by the Dean as looking for impact in our practice. Well, here we go, and that's going back to Kamal's and also his generous words, I think, the work on the Pacific. This is actually Tuvalu. That's one of the 9 islands of Tuvalu. That's where you land. And when I go back to my students, back at Fletcher, at Tufts, and we discuss sometimes climate change, not at the center part of our class as collateral, and they say, well, yeah, but you know, if we just address climate change and we do not think about growth, what's going to happen to developing countries? There's an argument that climate justice is not about climate, but how about distribution of wealth in the planet? Okay, and we have those kinds of discussion, but when we see this, and we know that in a couple of decades, that and many of others that are nations are going to cease to exist, that when Iro from the Cook Islands says, Mr. Alvarado, you see there? And he points at the ocean. And I said, yeah, Iro, what's that? He said, that's where we used to play soccer a couple of years ago. Or when I was a kid, he said. You start to see reality differently. Ironically, one of my experience was that, as I was mentioned, for example, World Bank and the work on technique with GCCM, with Colombia, has been one of the cornerstones to tackle this. Fun enough, when you engage with the Pacific Island Forum and its leaders, the level of trust, for example, on financial institutions or other institutions is very low because of how we engage. Think about, and there are many terror stories, but just to mention one, a $1 million project loan that takes 7 years to be delivered while you're facing this crisis, even though you created the most relevant pieces of information about what's your problem. But you try to engage, or another of these paradoxes. You need a grant of about $40,000 for adaptation, which means taking your power generators from the floor up in hospitals and schools. Because of flooding, everything goes a blackout. So that's an adaptation project. It costs $40,000. You don't have access, but to fly a representative of an international institution costs $40,000 to follow a project on that. So those are some of those contradictions on how we frame things. My learning through the past years while working in this community on the climate mobility, it's being very mindful about engaging. And I think that that's one of the practices that's been developed here at Colombia, in GCCM and others. Because yes, there's a role of data and facilitation of data, of sharing what we see and what we perceive the future will look like. And that's critical. But if we stop there, as that being reality, we might not impact perhaps the way we want to, or our impact might go in other directions. Because let's call it, and I like to call it, that's adaptative journeys. Because climate mobility, as an expression, already has the implicit notion that somebody's going to be moving due to climate. And let's say you go to a community, you show the data, and you talk about climate mobility. That, as stay home, can be very threatening, as in the case of the pandemic. Because there are many shades of how that can unfold. I mean, we've seen even the concept climate immobility develop. People that cannot move for various reasons, economic reasons, conditions of the household, etc. Right to stay. People enforcing, saying, I don't care. This is where my heritage is. My ancestors are here. I am not without my land. So therefore, if I move, I cease to exist. enforcing the right to stay. I was present while as many young people here, a young poet from the Marshall Islands shared a poem saying, if necessary, we'll develop fins and gills, and we'll swim until we're exhausted, and they will die, but we won't move. And then you start to say, well, it's not only about data. And it is, but it's not only about climate justice, it's about many things. Complexity. Inside adaptations, how can you stay but will adapt? And how that connects with climate finance, and how that connects with projects, infrastructure, community relocation. You remain in your community, but you're relocated from where you are. National relocation. You stay in your country, but still you go to another community. Fiji has already started to relocate. Panama has relocated people. Or beyond borders relocation, which appears to be one that draws lots of attention. You know, migration brings lots of attention nowadays in this world. So let's go back to the decarbonization plan and to David Boone's premise. Why we call it decarbonization plan at first? Because our theory of change was fixed on the real notion that there's lots of carbon in the atmosphere that we need to absorb or take away for us to survive. So we bought into our own theory of change and put it as the way to reach out to others. But many other people say, why do you care about a decarbonization plan when there's unemployment, when we don't have enough to eat, when there is problems at the hospitals? And then you will say, well, but they are connected. Yes, but you threw away the ladder. You're not connecting the points of your behavior to people, even though you're supported. Same here. Well, what will I call it now? I don't know. I'm open for suggestions, but a national plan for livelihoods improvement, I don't know. Because at the end, that's also the thing that the plan does. It helps hospitals in their queues because of the decreased level of pollution in the air. It creates new jobs because of the industries involved in the transformation. It improves the agriculture sector because by mitigating emissions, you're more competitive in international markets because your products are already offset. All of those benefits are still there, but the framing goes from the carbon problem, which you're fixed into, to a broader societal problem. You go beyond what you synthesize as your theory. Stay home, similar. I mean, back then, that was our best approach. You stay home, you vaccinated, but yeah, and that's what the best World Health Organization, Pan American Organization of Health, our specialists will say, and we will repeat. But yeah, we left some behind because of that. So protection for all. But if you really go to protection for all, that means you need to go to those households that cannot stay at home and protect them. And even go for those who do not have a home to protect them. And that requires efforts and resources, even resources, to be honest, that we did not have at the moment. But the approach is completely different. The approach is absolutely different, even backed by the same science. Some will say, well, yeah, but this is an exercise of framing. I don't think it's an exercise of framing. I'm involved with also with the behavioral change community. But I think that the first step on your behavioral change is not trying to tell everybody else what to change on. It's to see within yourself what you need to change. And I think when I look back, we needed to change an approach that somehow was correct and pioneering. I mean, and yield results, but also, maybe without being intended, was protected by privilege. How do we not replicate that? We go through measurement a lot. I'll be closing. But this too bring a reminder. The first one is how we operate a lot. If you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. So we are fixed with measurement, right? A lot. It's good. It's good. But then the second one is a great reminder. When a measurement becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measurement. When it becomes a target, when it's not a tool anymore, it's not a theory anymore, it's reality. When it's reality and how we're measured, we're not working for the people, we're working for the target. Whose reality counts then when we do this work? It cannot only be this reality. And it has to be at the same level, if not a level more humble, to the realities we are trying to transform, to change. So, what will it be in climate mobility? I don't know. We have time, but that's the reflection. Because we do want to transform things. We want to protect people. We want a fairer world, a more just world. But let's just be a reminder then to keep the ladder. Connect the dots back home. If we are not able to tell people, not only rationally, but emotionally, why this matters for you, why decarbonizing is not decarbonizing. Decarbonizing is an act of love and transformation. We have to be able to connect the dots literally back home if we are to serve. Because if not, we'll be serving only ourselves. We need to serve others. That's what it's required from us at this moment in time in history. And maybe that's the two, or the small piece of advice I have after looking back to those experiences. Consider success, maybe. But this demonstrates they could be better. So that gives also hope. Some people call it progress. Let's hope that's the case. And you're welcome to visit Costa Rica too. Thank you.
Reminds me of the mayor's debate, which I watched on recording yesterday, and who has the most experience? Well, obviously you have to live the experience to be able to actually speak as you did just now, so thank you very much, President Alvarado. So I'm going to invite up now three panelists: Susi Moser, who is president of Suzanne Moser Research and Consulting; Karen Chapple, who is the director of the School of Cities and professor of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto; and Jola Ajibade. Jola, you're here, I know, associate professor in Department of Environmental Science at Emory University. We're going to have a short discussion around this kind of concept of what do we mean by moving from a managed retreat focus to a more broad climate mobility focus. So welcome up, and thank you. Jola, where are you? There she is. She's coming down. Great. And I think I have my slides up, so that's great. So, you know, managed retreat has traditionally been construed as moving infrastructure and people out of harm's way and then letting the land revert to a more wild state, perhaps parks or playgrounds or other things that can be flooded when high tide rises or when there's a major flooding event, but then kind of the water recedes and you can still use that space. It's also come to encompass things like accommodation strategies, raising houses on stilts, for instance, making homes either fireproof or hurricane-proof. And, you know, presentations at this conference in the past have focused on things like mitigation strategies, dikes, seawalls, beach replenishment, nature-based solutions. The discussions around land use policy, zoning, insurance markets are often very technical, and we're going to have a lot of them this week. For those of you who came here wanting to feast on that kind of banquet, we're going to have a lot of those sorts of sessions. But today, we want to open up the discussion a little bit to some broader topics. 2023, we actually focused on a term, habitability. What does it mean that a place is habitable or not? And then we also opened up to more international discussions. So we had a nice, rich group of international participants. And we explored topics such as immobility, which is the focus of a World Cafe in 2023, and then it resulted in this publication by a number of people who are here today. But the point I'm going to make is that managed retreat, which is kind of in the center of this diagram here, is just one among many different strategies that we may want to consider taking. It may not be the most appropriate strategy in every context in every part of the world. As one colleague said after the last conference, well, the term managed retreat may not travel as well to some parts of the global south, for instance. But it's still a very important concept and one that we don't want to simply jettison. It also acknowledges that, if we look at, the policy responses such as buyouts, they're often dwarfed by the actual movements of population. So if we look at the population change between 2010 and 2020 in the US and compare it to the small number of buyouts that have occurred, I think the biggest bubble has about 500 buyouts in Houston, but then some of the you look at the biggest circle is 300, and then you look at where they are in relation to human population growth, where the green areas on this map represent areas that are growing anywhere from 0 to 5% to up to 20% higher in that decadal period. And if you just look at absolute numbers, they simply dwarf the number of buyouts. So sometimes our policy tools simply aren't able to keep up with the massive demographic shifts that are occurring. So I think a broader kind of climate mobility perspective can help us to take into account some of these shifts. We did some work for the UK Foresight project, which was really a benchmark in 2011. Many of you are familiar with it, which was migration and global environmental change. They commissioned massive amounts of studies. And we looked at how populations have changed or net migration has occurred in various biomes. So if you look at drylands, for instance, globally, this is by decades. So the bars represent 4 decades from 1970 all the way up to 2010. In all the rest of the world, you see people moving out of dryland areas. That's below the bar, okay? And especially in Asia, the longest bars, people are moving out. But in the US, people are moving into dryland areas. The same goes for mountainous areas. And in the coastal zone, of course, what we're seeing globally, I don't know why this animation, here we go. Pretty much everyone's moving towards the coast, with the greatest movements being in Asia. So this is just to show that there are many, many issues that we might want to consider in addition to the very limited conversation, which is extremely important, especially in the US context, around managed retreat. So today we're going to just have this panel kind of open up by discussing some of these larger topics. And I'll just begin maybe with a question to the panel of, what might be missing. This is a diagram I sort of helped develop with members of the Climate Mobility Network here at Columbia University. And it was, a way of kind of mapping our territory, what we were kind of looking at. But there's things that are missing here as well. So I maybe start with that question to the panel, if there's anything that you see that could be added here. And if you can't see it on that tiny screen, sorry, it's only showing in presenter mode, you can look up behind you. And we'll start with that question, and then we'll move on. And I guess maybe I'll take a place at the table as well, and we can continue the conversation.
Sure. Absolutely.
Susie, thank you so much.
So I'd be happy to jump in on this because I love diagrams and I love this diagram. And then the one thing, as I pondered it, the one thing I started missing was a sense of the dynamism systems and the feedback mechanisms. So yes, we have our sample policies, but each one of them has unintended consequences, which then affect the dynamics of mobility. And we have individuals underlying this that have complex decision matrices of their own, like where's my family, where is my partner, where am I going to be able to make a living? So that's what I would incorporate.
If I can add to that, thank you so much. First, I want to thank Alex, and I want to thank everyone for being here. This is one of my favorite conferences to attend, so I'm really excited to be here. And just to build off of what you've just said, I think absolutely you're right in terms of dynamics, but also in terms of the power structure, that's not represented anywhere here in terms of how justice issues or even issues of equity can be included at different stages, whether it's in the livelihood and food security, or even the sea level rise and disaster response. At each of these quadrants or columns, there are power dynamics that I think needs to be considered. There are issues of equity and justice, and there are issues around capacity building on all of them. And I think that could have been things that could be reflected on as well. So I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you. And also just welcome everyone. It's wonderful to be here at this conference. And thank you, President Alvarado, for a wonderful and a hard act to follow, I want to say.
Yes.
I haven't heard any president say decarbonization is an act of love and transformation, but I would say that is so true. And so I would add migration and mobility is an act of love and transformation. It seems to me that's entirely missing from this diagram. The whole human dimension of it, conflict management is sort of the closest thing to even recognizing that maybe somewhere people might not like what they have to do. So if we approached it from that, we would be paying attention to education, culture, human well-being, beyond just health, right? So those are the aspects that I would say are most missing. And I maybe want to say one other thing, which is that if we're increasingly driven to focus on impacts and how to respond to those impacts, i.e. the adaptation side of the equation, I think we will miss the deep decolonizing work, the deep work we must do to actually address not just the causes of climate change, but the deep causes of social vulnerability. And all of that, to me, feels, it's not at least explicit in here, but it has to be lifted up in each of those steps that we are taking on this schedule, on this diagram.
Great. Back to the drawing board on the diagram.
Sorry.
So I'm going to ask you guys to pass me your notes afterwards because I really do want to make this better. So Karen, we know that a lot of displaced populations from natural disasters and even refugees from compound conflict and climate events do end up in urban areas. So how can we help cities better prepare? This is, I know, an area that you've been focusing a lot.
Yeah, well, cities are where the majority of the population around the world lives, and it's where most climate migrants land. Why? Because that's where the jobs are. That's where your social networks bring you to. That's where there's actually housing, whether it may not be suitable housing, but people will crowd into the existing housing that's there. And that's where the refugee organizations are. There's a deep history in cities of welcoming migrants of various kinds. And the thing is about cities is that's where we need people to land. We need to have that talent coming in to cities on an ongoing basis. We need their labor. We need that talent that can lead to more innovation in cities. Innovation is only going to happen in our great cities of the world. And our cities are the seedbed of democracy. And so this is where social movements take place and where social change originates. And cities are resilient in the face of climate instability in a way that is always surprising and is almost an optimistic point. Cities are also really important to protect right now because they're under attack. There are crises of housing affordability and income inequality. There's failing infrastructure throughout much of the world, aging physical infrastructure, declining civic infrastructure, and there's a political attack on cities too, which is ongoing. So we, a group of us, a global research network of academics and researchers, formed a network called CIDRARC, which will be the next panel. But what we're really interested in is thinking about how people and city governance perceive and manage risk together, and particularly deal with the double and triple displacements that occur as displaced climate refugees or climate migrants land in cities and then may be displaced by another climate crisis as they have settled on the edges of a river that floods, and then are pushed into a housing market that is very tight, and then as a result others are displaced from the housing market. And this makes cities really the ground zero for climate migrants, and is really going to force us to focus on ways to innovate, to make sure we understand cities both as receiving and sending climate mobility centers.
Great, thank you, Karen. So Susi, you've been a leader in the adaptation space for a long time. You've worked with communities in California, now you're in Massachusetts, and I believe you're in other states as well, working with a lot of community-based organizations. And you're now pivoting some of your work to receiving communities. So I'm curious what you, when you think about mobility and resilience as a new term, what does resilience building look like for you?
Yeah, so I guess maybe I want to pick up with one thing that where you left us off, which is sort of that emphasis on cities, which I can't disagree with, given how many of us live there, but I think it would be a profound mistake to ignore the rural areas. I mean, we've seen that in this country, what happens when we do politically. So we don't get anywhere, even for cities, if we ignore the rural areas. Anyway, having said that, I think this mobility and resilience framing, to me, it really embodies a fundamental paradox, which is resilience in most lay understanding, and even in much research and practice, sort of implies something like, let's keep the things we have as they are, right? That's ultimately actually what that word means. Even with all the transformation and adaptation thrown into the definitions in IPCC, it's still about keeping something we want as it is, at least in the most fundamental. Mobility is all about change. So how do we reconcile, and it really raises deep questions about what we want to keep in the face of profound change. And I think that's a great opening, and that's really, I hope, a lot of what we do this week, that we keep staying in that tension between the two of them. What's happened, obviously, in this country is that basically, at the federal level, we've had the rug be, pulled out from under all of our efforts. So now we're trying to maintain what we love in the face of change and increasing outright hostility. Taking the data away, taking anything that we're in preparation and prevention, taking anything funding-wise, technical assistance-wise away from us. So I think it's a very different set of circumstances in which we're trying to do that. And I think that is really where we need to move. We need to name it bluntly. We're not, if there was a spectrum before from fully supportive to hostile environment where we're now, we were maybe like 2/3 on the supportive side in the last administration. Now we're really far on the other side of that spectrum. And how to do this work and focus on not just the policies which aren't going to come from the federal level anymore. They're, in fact, accelerating, I think, our dislocation and displacement. It's really now a question of how do we support ourselves with each other in coalition, addressing multiple problems at once because we don't have the resources to address it in siloed fashion and cause more problems on the side. So I think there's really deep questions, and to me, the opportunity in this crazy moment that we're in to really look at how do we address this in fundamentally different ways. This is the transformative impact that, you just put before us that I think we're really all facing now.
Thanks, Susi. So Jola, I'm curious, what does this move towards the anti-immigrant populism that we're seeing in many parts of the world, in the US and in Europe, mean for safe and orderly migration as set forth in the Global Compact on Migration? Ooh.